The pine barrens of East Texas rose and fell like a dark sea, their needles whispering over the hardpan where wagon ruts turned to scars. In that country where cypress knees clawed at black water and the horizon could look like an empty verdict, there once stood a chain of camps that promised salvation to the ruined. Between 1845 and 1881, more than 300 souls went in. Only a thin scattering of them ever came back down those trails alive, and the ones who did returned small and shivering, as if the wilderness had gnawed them down to something less than human. They spoke of purification rites that made death feel like water offered to a fevered mouth. When federal men finally forced their way past the hymn-sung gates in 1881, they found more than fanaticism. They found ground that was too tired to grow anything except secrets, and a cemetery that had no sermons, just nearly 200 bodies, each telling the same quiet story of pain prolonged beyond reason. And inside a leather coffer, bound like a church Bible and locked like a bank, they found ledgers, careful, tidy, proud, that turned faith into a profit and loss account and laid bare a scheme that had run for decades while the frontier drank and prayed and looked the other way. Texas had only just hitched its star to the Union when the brothers drifted in from Arkansas with letters that smelled of lamp oil and respectability. They wore the right collars and spoke the right scriptures. They took the name Damnation as if it were a cross to shoulder, and people nodded because the frontier was the sort of place where names grew on men rather than the other way around. There was Preacher Malachi, 6 feet even, razor-parted black hair, eyes the cool gray of a well's last water. His voice could make a killing man sob and swear to put the knife away forever. There was Evangelist Cornelius, narrow as a fence post, cheeks sunk deep enough to hold rain, reading guilt off a face like a tally off a slate. And there was Prophet Jebediah, thick-wristed, iron-handed, the kind of build that made doors feel unnecessary. He claimed the Almighty sent him pictures. He called his work healing. He said pain was instruction, and instruction was mercy. They raised their canvas circles in the loneliest cuts of the piney woods, where the cypress swamps bled into the timberlands, and a man could go missing without calling it a disappearance. From a distance, the camps looked simple, crosses knocked together from rough lumber, a central fire that breathed up sparks like winter stars, tents set in a clean ring as if they'd been measured by a carpenter who feared the Lord more than he feared the mud. The clientele was the frontier itself, gamblers whose luck had left like a wife in the night, trailhands with a dead man's name clinging to their boots, women who'd been sold more often than they had been spoken to, deserters whose uniforms had become accusations, and a surprising number of citizens with pressed coats and careful handshakes. Fraud had a way of shining a man's shoes. So did politics. The brothers offered an answer that fit the heat and the hard living. Sin burned out of the flesh, so the spirit could go where it couldn't arrive unscalded. There were no shortcuts, Malachi said, and the people believed him because the frontier had taught them the same thing in different words. Testimonials bloomed like bluebonnets after rain. Newspapers printed letters from grateful mothers and sober fathers. My boy went in a wolf and came out a lamb. My girl's eyes are clean as mountain snow. The brothers do God's work and do it quickly. The letters traveled further than the wagons, and the camps filled, and the circle widened, and still the tents kept moving. 6 months here, half a year there, citing God's call and never leaving much behind but poles and rumor. On an August night swollen with heat, a cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell walked into Marshall and talked about a camp near the dark mirror of Caddo Lake. He'd left a strong man and returned a scarecrow. His hair had bleached to ash as if fear were a lie that burned from the inside. He shook like a dog after thunder and flinched like a colt at any sound that didn't ask permission first. He told the town pastor about graves dug by the sinner's own hands and the way earth pressed over a face with only a mouth and nose left to argue with the air. He told how the brothers called it being born into glory. He told how some men never breathed again and how their stillness was called perfection. The sheriff called it frontier nerves and a hard conscience. A month later, Hartwell disappeared as if the land had simply tucked him away. Years turned like cards on a gambler's knee. Letters kept arriving in parlors and boarding houses. He has gone to Oregon, to California, to the Rocky Mountains to preach. He needs a little money to keep the gospel moving. He will write again soon. Family sent coins and hope westward with the post, then settled into waiting that had no season. A New Orleans mother, Mrs. Westbrook, found the edges wrong on her son's handwriting, as if a familiar voice had been played on a stranger's instrument. A traveling doctor, Elizabeth Thornton, treated a few who crawled back out of the pines. They didn't smell like redemption to her. They smelled like burned rope and old fear, and they sat very still, and when they prayed, it wasn't for themselves. The war came and swallowed everything, spitting back fewer men and more ghosts. When it ended, a young ranger out of Austin, Captain James Morrison, took a stack of missing person reports and spread them on a table until they made a map. The disappearances moved like a slow fire line through the timber. Where the camps had been, the names went thin. Morrison's reports were numbering and careful, the sort of pages that make superiors stop chewing and start reading. He spoke to widows and riders and a man named Tobias Fletcher, who drank until his tongue unlatched and called himself a gravedigger. Fletcher said not all graves were for lessons. Some were for keeping. He said Jebediah's hands could pull secrets like weeds and leave a man upright long enough to recite the inventory of his life, land, sisters' debts, bank names, and then, when every root was freed, snap him like kindling. Fletcher ran before morning, eyes rolling white at every shadow. Morrison took what he'd given and went east to Caddo's slow black water with 3 men he trusted. The forest there grew wrong, settlers said. The trees twisted like they'd listened to the wrong sermon. Birds choked back their songs, and even the insects seemed to have made other plans. Ezekiel Marsh, an old trapper with cypress stains on his boots, told Morrison the ground was not natural. He said animals knew to skirt it. Men should too. The rangers made their own camp a few miles out, close enough to taste smoke when the wind leaned right. At night, the air carried voices that sounded like prayers braided into pain and then pulled tight. Sometimes the sound snapped off mid-syllable, and that silence made the men shift their rifles on their knees. Come dawn, they walked the perimeter and found crosses with numbers instead of names, fresh mounds numbering too many for symbols. The smell told the truth the crosses tried to obscure. It was the old battlefield smell, Private Thompson said. Fresh, stale, layered. A business smell, not a frenzy, they watched. The days opened with hymns and hands held aloft, with Malachi's cedar voice and Cornelius's pale stare and Jebediah's heavy palms on trembling shoulders. Afterward, people went into the tents and came out hollowed. Cornelius kept a book and a quill that seemed to drink names, dates, sins, any fact that might be tightened later into a snare. In the afternoon, Jebediah's healings began. The rangers could not see much and were grateful, in a way, for canvas. They heard enough to understand that what happened inside was slow and professional. This wasn't zealotry on a boil, it was a practiced temperature. At dusk, the brothers staged their ceremony of ascension, all candles and scripture and gentleness pasted over a deed as cold as accountancy. Later, shovels spoke to the earth. On the 3rd day, a family came, dust-silvered and timid, 2 children clinging to their mother's skirt. That decided it. Morrison chose the evening service, when all 3 brothers would be exposed. He timed his men's approach to the rhythms of the singing. But the brothers' piety had always been built like a fort. Gunmen stepped out of the shadows with their own psalms written in steel. The firefight was long and loud. Sergeant Crawford went to his knees with a red bloom darkening his sleeve. 2 accomplices fell and did not rise. Some of the penitents cried out to spare their saviors and threw themselves into the bullet's way, which told Morrison as much about the camp as any ledger ever could. When the smoke thinned, Morrison found the records tent. Inside was a clerk's heaven and a prosecutor's dream. Names, numbers, monies received and monies expected. Methods matched to temperaments. Letters copied line by line, some signed with a hand trained to imitate grief. A family tree turned into a prophet tree. The brothers weren't damnation at all. They were Blackwood, Jacob and Cornelius by blood, and Jebediah by utility. A soldier named Walter Grimm who had learned too much about pain during the war and never quite unlearned it. Their collars were borrowed, their testimonials purchased or printed, their God shaped like a balance sheet. Cornelius made one last move, dragging a boy into the light, pressing iron to a small head and preaching the kind of mercy that leaves no one better. Thompson shot the pistol out of his hand with a neatness that made witnesses blink. The rest surrendered because they were canny and the odds had turned. What followed was the sort of work that does not make stories often, only coroners and ledgers. The pits opened. Dr. Thornton came with her instruments and her steady voice. The numbers hardened into bones. The Rangers dragged a counterfeiter's shop out of the bush, plates and inks, stamps and seals. In one trunk lay a manual in Malachi's hand, written not in the language of faith but in the language of procedure. Find the lonely, praise them correctly, feed them scripture tailored to their need, harvest confession, extract particulars, stagger the pain to extend the yield, write to the families with phrases that test well, move on before the ground starts talking. The letters poured in from other states like a long bad weather system when word of the arrests spread. We sent money to California. He preached in Oregon. We haven't heard in 3 winters. Can you look? Churches had no record except the ones the brothers wrote for them. The trial filled a courthouse in Texas with heat and eyes. People wanted to see evil argue for itself, as if the sound of it might teach them how to lock their doors. The defense tried to wrap zeal around the deeds like gauze. The ledgers cut through it. Malachi took the stand and made no apology. He spoke of purpose like a farmer speaks of rain. Some will have it, some won't, and either way the crop must be got in. Cornelius explained confession as if he were teaching a craft. Grimm described pain the way a coachman describes reins. What to pull, what to slacken, how to keep the horse between the traces. Dr. Thornton spoke for the dead with a physician's clean precision. A few survivors came trembling to the rail. Hartwell among them, gray as old plank, whispering of dirt over mouths and a silence that pressed old hymns into new shapes. After the verdicts, the hangman did what the hangman is for. The brothers left the world in a November bright as a blade, still certain of their own cosmology. Grimm warned there were others. There always are. The state built new habits out of the case. Papers demanded of roving ministries, jurisdictions talking to one another like neighbors over a fence instead of strangers over a grave, rangers sharing methods instead of miracles. Dr. Thornton wrote a thin book with heavy pages that later men would call early work, and it said what she had already learned, that suffering arranged with method is not less wicked than suffering arranged with passion, only cleaner to count. Years softened the wagon ruts into memories, but some people still stepped wide around patches of ground in East Texas as if the earth remembered a weight it didn't want again. Hunters claimed their dogs grew quiet near certain bayous. Fishermen said the cypress there listened. It is easy to laugh at that if you live in the city and your dead are tucked away in proper lots. Out there, where the trees can look like congregations and the fog can look like incense, a man might feel watched by history itself. The thing the brothers understood best was not scripture or anatomy but appetite. They learned the particular hunger of the ruined, the wish to be told that pain and goodness could be made to rhyme if you just hit the words hard enough. They offered that rhyme. They charged for it. In the end, they proved a smaller point as well, one the frontier had been making for years. That charity without suspicion becomes another kind of weather, and there are always men willing to farm it. The frontier had plenty of loneliness, and if loneliness were a currency, the brothers were bankers. They took deposits in secret and paid out in silence. Captain Morrison, promoted and gray around the temples sooner than he ought to have been, kept the ledgers in a locked case for training new men. He would lay them open across a desk and tell the young rangers what the numbers meant and what they didn't. He would tap a neat column showing monies extracted from a mother who stitched late into candle hours for every dollar. And he would say, "This is what careful looks like without conscience." Then he would close the book and send them out to ride, because the work is always somewhere else by the time you're ready for it. The camps are gone, and most of the crosses fell and rotted back into the soil that once shouldered them. But the story lingers because stories like it always do. Evil, when it is tidy, seems almost reasonable if you don't stare too long. That is part of its trick. The rest of the trick is dressing for the part. A good voice, a better ledger, a promise that feels like water in a drought. People are still thirsty. The country remains large. There are still roads where dust lifts and hangs and settles over tracks until all anyone can say for sure is that somebody passed, and somebody didn't make it home. If you listen hard in the timber, under the cicadas and the wind working the needles, you can almost hear Malachi's measured cadence in the skitter of a pen across paper, the careful spelling of a stranger's life. And then, beneath that, the smaller sounds that tell the truer tale, a shovel's bite in damp earth, a page turning, a breath held too long. It is not that such things belonged only to that century or that state. It is that they fit anywhere men come trailing shame and hope in equal measure, and another man has found a way to monetize both. The brothers called it purification. The law called it murder. The ground, having learned the weight of it, calls it nothing at all.